Dijon, 1816. Cjbeards, a young mathematics teacher, is preparing for a journey of several weeks aboard a ship which will take him to St. Louis, Senegal, a trading post where he will be teaching French to young indigenous people. Europeans had been present on the coasts of Africa for 3 centuries by then. St. Louis was founded by the French in 1659 and quickly specialized in the export of gold, gum arabic, and slaves. A century later, following the Revolution of 1789, St. Louis obtained the status of French commune. If this new status only offered locals partial rights, it allowed France to establish a first form of colonial administration on the continent. In 1816, Julien Cjbeards became the first governor of Senegal. Having barely taken office, he is already planning to attempt incursions into the interior lands, whose reaches still remain unknown. However, the populations who live there are hostile to the advance of the settlers, and to pacify these territories, the governor understands that he must train natives knowing French so that they can serve as intermediaries. An idea then came to him, creating the first French school of Senegal. By letter, he asked the Ministry of the Navy and Colonies to send a French teacher. The choice will fall on Cjbeards. The first lesson was given in March 1817. From the first days, Jean realized that he was facing students for whom French was a completely foreign language. Out of pragmatism, he decided to set up a teaching method that was both mutual and bilingual. This is unprecedented. Students learn to read and write in their native language before moving on to French, while the most gifted students help their classmates in difficulty. Jean was also interested in their languages, even going so far as to publish a few years later the first French Wolof and French Bambara dictionary. However, in the cultural and political context of the time, this approach met with very little enthusiasm from the French administration, which saw African languages as nothing more than dialects or shapeless jargons. The professor was the subject of numerous attacks and, probably out of discouragement, ended up returning to France in 1819. This does not mean, however, that at the beginning of the 19th century, the colonial administration wanted to spread the French language for its own sake. The teaching of French was then considered solely as an instrument available to the colonial power to ensure territorial management and exploit the immense resources with which the continent abounds. Africa is characterized by a dizzying linguistic diversity. Hundreds of languages are often spoken in a single territory, and if certain languages enjoy a wider diffusion, such as Fulani, with the exception of French, no indigenous language can allow France to manage all the territories to be conquered. It is therefore imperative to continue teaching French to train clerks, accountants, secretaries, interpreters, in short, all the subordinate positions which will be occupied by the natives. Baron Jean-François Roger, appointed new governor of Senegal in 1822, understood very well the important commercial stakes at hand. I have grand expectations for these young people. What outlets cannot they offer to our trade? It is perhaps also reserved for them to make us aware of Timbuktu and the course and mouth of the Niger, and all the mysteries of interior Africa. Baron Roger is ambitious and decides to open other schools. To do this, the colonial authorities opted for a confessional approach by soliciting the help of religious congregations established in the colony since 1817. The project was a success and encouraged the administration to call on more missionaries. Once installed, they act as they please, their only directive being to teach in French. A few years later, a secondary school project where elements of Latin, history, geography, and drawing would be taught according to the standards of the metropolis was even considered. However, for fear that too much education would harm colonial interests, the project was quickly abandoned. There would be content to train Africans useful to the economy. The absence of a clearly defined method thus demonstrates that at its beginnings, the colonial administration did not have a clearly defined assimilationist policy. But the state of affairs is about to change radically. Louis Faidherbe was appointed head of the colony in 1854. Under his leadership, the colonial administration created the first milestones of the future French West Africa by strongly extending the influence of Paris in the region and invested in the development of the colony. The port of Dakar is created, and the Dakar-Niger Railway project is set in motion. But above all, Faidherbe implemented a first real assimilationist policy. If the colonial administration had given up subordinating the education of the natives to their religious conversion, Faidherbe still implemented a French-centered policy, believing that only the French language should be used in all institutions, from army to school. Beyond cultural assimilation, he led intense armed expeditions against the Moors, the Toucouleurs, and the Wolofs, and applied a policy of dividing the local ruling classes. To ensure the lasting submission of indigenous peoples, in 1855 he opened the School of Hostages in St. Louis, which, as its name indicates, took hostage the sons of chiefs and notables in the dual objective of controlling the latter and forming French-speaking allies for the colonial power using traditional hierarchies. This pragmatic approach is essential in this era dominated by the search for complete security for the trade of the Senegal River and the process of pacification of the interior lands, which are closely mixed with the desire for practical control of the environment, the exploitation and development of which had barely begun with Faidherbe. European industrial capitalism, in full swing, seeks to maintain its profit rates by exploiting ever more people and markets. At the end of the 19th century, it is time to regulate European expansion in Africa so that the capitals of the old continent can share its abundant resources. The division of Africa was established at the Berlin Conference in 1885, determining borders which remained largely unchanged thereafter. France then began a truly civilizing policy influenced by the success of the centralization it imposed on its national territory. Indeed, if the African linguistic map is about to be fundamentally redrawn, France is not left out. In the years 1881 and 82, Jules Ferry, Minister of Public Education, introduced major reforms in the French education system. France is gradually transforming into a unilingual state, where regional languages no longer have a place. Linguistic centralization becomes a policy in itself, which was exported to Africa. In 1883, Ferry supported the creation of the famous Alliance Française, a private institution benefiting from the moral and financial support of the state. The members of its administration committee, including Louis Faidherbe, are all linked to colonial expansion, and the first article of its statutes clearly specifies that its aim is to spread the French language outside France and mainly in our colonies and in the countries subject to our protectorate. With Jules Ferry, the civilizing policy is underway because the superior races have the duty to civilize the inferior races. The French language becomes the language of civilization, and school its main driver of action. Even if such comments may shock today, the Alliance's action was widely supported by French politicians of the time, including the famous Jean Jaurès. The Alliance is right to think above all of the diffusion of our language. Our colonies will only be French in intelligence and heart when they understand a little French. For France, language is the necessary instrument of colonization. From 1886, schools multiplied throughout the territory of the Empire. Military posts also housed schools to train interpreters, workers, and technicians needed by the French army, and were even ordered to bring children to school by force if necessary. Educational instructions were minimal, limited to teaching French, reading, writing, and arithmetic. In 1903, Ernest Rome, Governor-General of French West Africa, implemented decrees to centralize secular education. Education will now be structured into schools of different levels, governed by a pyramid scheme with distinct programs. Camille Guy, governor of Senegal, was quickly tasked with setting up a network of village schools, regional schools, and urban schools to extend the education system across the entire colonial territory when missionary schools focused mainly on urban centers. However, making Africans French in intelligence and heart had a cost that the colonial administration could not bear. A French West Africa normal school was then created in Senegal in 1903 to train local teachers, thus making it possible to reduce costs by recruiting more indigenous teachers. The new policy quickly bore fruit, since between 1904 and 1913 the number of indigenous instructors increased significantly. Succeeding Roume in 1908, the famous William Ponty continued the policy of his predecessor and charged George Hardy, teacher and future director of education in French West Africa, with building a real assimilation program. If the teaching method is now standardized and overseen by a clear assimilationist ideology, the main objective has not changed. They must continue to train personnel directly useful to colonial economic development while avoiding providing too much education which could lead the natives to embrace independence ideas. Similar to the division of labor, the division of schools according to geographical areas therefore aimed to optimize the exploitation of the colonies. In rural areas, the emphasis was placed on work in the fields, with school gardens resembling real production farms intended for European populations. The assimilationist policy of the French colonial power did not put an end to the class war, and of course not everyone had access to school. Even at this time, the French administration continued to play on traditional hierarchical structures by favoring the sons of chiefs. And despite families' aspirations to send their children to school, their limited numbers represented a major obstacle. To top it off, the quality of education provided varied greatly depending on the geographic area. While village schools would employ instructors who could barely read, urban schools generally operated with European staff according to metropolitan standards. The centralized structuring of education throughout the colonial territory required the development of a method adapted to local realities. In the 1910s, the colonial administration took another step in its assimilationist policy by creating real learning methods based on an artificial Franco-African culture. In 1915, Moussa and Jigla, Story of Two Little Black Boys, the first French method for African students, was published. Then, in 1930, the most famous of them, Mamadou and Bineta by André Daven. This teacher and writer, who spent a large part of his career in various countries on the continent, was a fervent assimilationist who saw in the propagation of the language a way for French culture to remain alive on the continent, whatever the future of the empire. The Mamadou and Bineta method covered the entire primary school cycle. Although this method symbolizes the archetype of colonial methods, it enjoyed exceptional success and was still used in certain African countries in the 2000s. While the education policy implemented by George Hardy and William Ponty bears fruit in French West Africa, the situation in French Equatorial Africa remains unstable. Although they were present on Gabonese territory from the 1820s, the French left teaching in the hands of missionaries who only had the obligation to teach in French. Of course, in this part of the empire too, natives were trained to be useful to colonial development. In 1910, Martial Merlin was appointed first Governor-General of the newly created French Equatorial Africa. He tried with difficulty to organize education services. From 1918, a program similar to that developed by George Hardy in French West Africa was applied. Teaching was divided into 3 levels of education: village schools, regional schools, and upper primary schools, where indigenous teachers were still in the majority out of a desire to reduce costs. However, despite the regulations put in place, it is clear that education was in decline in this part of the empire. The number of teachers was too low to meet teaching needs. The situation is all the more paradoxical since the French occupation began with high school enrollment. Around 1880, almost all the children of Libreville attended school. However, between the wars, the programs, the timetables, and teaching methods were not even defined, and no inspections were carried out. As for the Governor-General, he showed himself incapable of regulating private schools. Despite the decree of 1883 imposing French as the language of instruction, private schools run by missionaries often did not care much, favoring local languages to facilitate catechism work. In 1938, a report was urgently sent to the President of the Republic. It was imperative to regulate private education in French Equatorial Africa. Albert Lebrun then signed a presidential decree requiring that teaching in private schools be done exclusively in French, with exceptions for religious schools which could teach religion in local languages. However, despite these regulations, private establishments would often continue to use African languages. Thus, resistance can be explained by the fact that the congregations only depending on their order, the colonial administration had few levers to impose any decisions on them. A reality little appreciated by the governors who, at the time, exercised absolute power on the colony. An observation was then made. The governors-general are incapable of organizing education. It is in this context that Marius Moutet enters the scene. Appointed Minister of Colonies in 1936, he encouraged increasing involvement of national education in African education, thus countering the exclusive control of governors-general. But the more the days and months pass, the more the empire's hours are numbered. At the beginning of 1944, General de Gaulle convened the Brazzaville Conference, during which the role and future of the empire would be determined. The conference promulgated the abolition of the indigenous code, and de Gaulle affirmed the definitive link between France and its colonies, a declaration ratified on October 27, 1946, by the Constitution of the Fourth Republic, which establishes the creation of the French Union. Each Union national theoretically had the status of citizen. After this conference, lively debates took place on changes in education policy. The French administration advocated maintaining the existing system, with its division into geographical areas. However, now that the indigenous code was abolished, supporters of national education and African elected officials were pleading for significant reforms, with every citizen having the opportunity to access the same quality of education as in mainland France. African schools must be integrated into French schools. Rapidly, initiatives to transform the African education system emerged, such as the creation of secondary schools. The Brazzaville Conference is therefore of capital importance in several respects. It marked the end of the absolute domination of colonial administrators over education in Africa, and thus opened the way to the developments that will accompany the period of decolonization, which is about to see the light of day. If France played a major role in the spread of French on the African continent, the role of Belgium was not negligible. In 1885, Belgium was allocated the immense territory of the Congo. First, the personal possession of King Leopold II, the colony became the Belgian Congo in 1808. Like France, Belgium saw language as a tool of colonial administration. The objective of educational policies was to train a workforce adapted to the economic needs of the colony. However, the policies implemented by the kingdom somewhat differ from those of its powerful neighbor. While Paris exports its centralizing linguistic model, Brussels, perhaps because of its own multilingualism, is more attentive to African linguistic diversity, at least in appearance. When the Belgians arrived in Congo, the territory was marked by remarkable linguistic diversity. Several hundred languages are spoken there, which led the colonial power to quickly choose 4 lingua franca: Lingala, Kiswahili, Chiluba, and Kikongo, which would serve as vehicular languages between French and all the other Congolese languages. As for France, teaching differs depending on the geographical area. So-called official schools occupy most urban centers, and teaching is provided in French according to Belgian school standards. As for the free schools, the most numerous ones. They were run by religious congregations scattered throughout the colonial territory. The programs were set by two successive texts in 1929 and 1938. Here again, the importance of French is strongly linked to the type of schools, urban or rural. In rural schools, the emphasis is on manual work. The program includes regular exercises, particularly in the field of agriculture, and teaching is provided in one of the four vehicular languages. In urban schools, where students are being prepared for more advanced studies, a larger part is reserved for the teaching of French. However, training for work and effort continues to be essential. Secondary schools, for their part, were exclusively urban and welcomed the best elements from primary schools. These schools prepared students for admission to specialized establishments where natives would be in contact with European populations and where emulation of white standards would be encouraged. Clerks, colored teachers, or even workers, craftsmen or foremen would be trained there. In short, all the subordinate positions which would allow Belgian companies established in the territory to reduce their costs. The more the years pass, the more the colonial power demonstrated its desire to make French a language reserved for the elite. In the second text governing education, which was published in 1938, Belgium affirmed that to guarantee effective education, it was crucial to teach in the native language or vehicular language of the natives. Nevertheless, the teaching of French, or Flemish to a much lesser extent, remains important at advanced levels of education. It is thus encouraged in secondary primary schools and specialized schools, leading to work contexts where there will be numerous contacts with Europeans. The teaching of the national language is therefore clearly recognized as creating ties between indigenous elites and the metropolis. But above all, this text reinforces the crucial distinction at the heart of school language policy, that between rural and urban schools. It is in urban schools that Belgium will train the future elites, who will speak French and have frequent contacts with European populations. Unlike French colonization, the Belgian colonial administration therefore recognized very early on the importance of national languages as vehicular languages. This does not mean, however, that the debate on which language to use did not take place in the Congo. However, unlike France, this debate was essentially a Belgian controversy marked by the extreme rivalry between Francophones and Flemings. Throughout colonial history, the latter sought to impose their language. In vain. After the Second World War, a brief attempt to introduce the teaching of both languages was undertaken, without much success. Faced with this failure, the Flemings sometimes turned into fervent defenders of the Congolese languages. Two positions will clash throughout the history of the Belgian Congo. The assimilationists, who favored French, and among whom we find many Congolese, and the indigenists, who favored Congolese languages for various reasons: the ease of conversion, the disappointment of not having been able to obtain a place for Flemish, the desire to reserve French only for the elite, the defense of African values and cultures, or the desire to prevent a single language from facilitating the emergence of a national consciousness which could endanger colonial interests. In conclusion, education policy in colonial Africa was marked by several evolving trends. Initially, responsibility for education was largely delegated to religious congregations before the establishment of a network of public schools where a centralized approach dominated. The main discernible element of linguistic policy was the desire of the colonial authorities to teach French to train Africans useful for economic development, a cheap workforce that was more easily administered through the interplay of divisions between rival ethnic groups. This administrative policy, however, had significant consequences on the linguistic future of the continent, because it was at the dawn of independence that French was given its most ambitious role to become the national language of artificially created states where hundreds of local languages often coexisted.